To everyone, welcome to the Chappaqua Library Foreign Policy Discussion Group. We are opening our 26th year of bringing you foreign policy experts on world events and challenges to the U.S. We are nonpartisan. Our views that are being presented are those of the speakers. I want to tell you we have terrific, and you will find out soon. We have actually been chasing our speaker for at least the past year. So we are really enthusiastic that we are now bringing him, and he is in Uzbekistan. So you can see we reach very far to get excellent speakers for you. Joining me also on our team is Amy Friedman, Naomi Merrow, Carolyn Resnick, and Tyler Beebe. So this is a great team. They work extremely hard searching out the best speakers. And I think you, since we do have an audience that looks forward to hearing our programs, I think you must be agreeing with us. So there are many pluses and minuses of programs over Zoom. We get to stay in warm houses when it's freezing outside. We get to reach across the country, or the world, as I just said, to get our speakers. And also Amy Friedman, in her other role, other than as a team member of the discussion group, is also chair of the government department at Pace University and has her class, Freedom in the World, on Zoom with us today. So welcome, Peter, and also Pace students. Yes, Ukraine and Russia are perhaps, maybe we think of it as David versus Goliath or democracy versus autocracy. And we look forward to hearing firsthand from a very seasoned diplomat and analyst who's held many different positions for the United States State Department and will give us a broader perspective on how to look at the war between these two countries and also in the context of Eastern Europe. So before I turn over the program, a little housekeeping. Our speaker will speak for 35 minutes. Then we will continue with questions from our panelists and from you, our viewers, with an end time at around 11:15. Peter has said that he can stay on a little bit longer, but I know that Amy also has her students waiting in the wings to also be able to talk to Peter. So we'll try and stay at that 11:15 deadline. So to our viewers, please enter your questions in the chat tab. Our program is being recorded and is available on the Chappaqua Library website under the Events tab and then Foreign Policy. So we did send out, or I would say very kindly, Leslie did send out the readings that Peter had sent us. A couple of them are books, so you have a lot of work to do after his talk if you would like to know more. If you didn't get them, they will also be included in the chat. So I am now turning over the program to Amy to introduce our guest speaker.
Great. Thank you, June. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, it's fine. I know I'm very far away. The camera is not zooming zooming in as much as we like, but maybe I'll get that fixed for next time. So it's my pleasure to announce our speaker today. Peter Neisuler is a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. State Department. He most recently served as the political counselor in our embassy in Warsaw, Poland. And his role there, he advised the U.S. ambassador on responses to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So he really got an up close and personal view of the start of this conflict. He spent his previous 7 years in the Middle East, first in Amman, Jordan, and then in Israel, where he covered Iranian affairs and counterterrorism in the political section of the embassy. He later served as deputy embassy spokesman, and he worked on U.S. policy easing Israel-Iran tensions and efforts to monitor and forestall Iran's nuclear program. He's served in Moscow as human rights and frozen conflicts officer, working on growing authoritarianism and human rights deterioration and Russia's interventions in the post-Soviet space. Peter has also served in Dubai, Macedonia, and in Washington in the Western European Affairs Bureau and in the Deputy Secretary's Office of Strategic Reform. Peter is currently working for the State Department's Office of Civil Rights. And full disclaimer, I've known Peter for a very long time. We go back to middle school, high school, and college. And so I'm delighted that we found a date that worked and that he's able to join us from so far away. So Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amy. And when I think about how long we've known each other, it's somewhat surreal to find myself sitting here now talking to you with all this distinguished company and the experiences I've had. So thank you very much for having me on. So I'll jump right in. Yeah, when you join the Foreign Service, you sign on a dotted line for worldwide availability, as they call it. There's no geographical specialization, but in way you do hone in on certain regions, and they hone in on you because once you develop a certain amount of expertise in speaking the languages and everything, you become, they start to seek you out to serve in these places. And as a result, my regions, perhaps inevitably, were always going to be Europe, and particularly the former Eastern Bloc and the Middle East. And that's to a large degree that goes all the way back to before I joined the Foreign Service. In fact, when Amy and I were in high school together, because I had a lot of formative kind of news and cultural experiences as an adolescent in the 1980s. When you're talking about Russia, it's things like the fact that in 11th grade, my teacher assigned me Dostoevsky, and it had the same effect on me that listening to Metallica might have had on another teenager. I was captivated by Russian literature, and I was also right around the time that the movie The Day After came out, which was a warning about nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And then at the same time, there were a lot of Middle Eastern crises in the 1980s as well that caught my attention. And so I think the groundwork was laid for the direction I was going to end up going in many years later as a diplomat. Over the course of serving in Moscow and then covering the Benelux countries in Washington and then serving in Warsaw, basically on the basis of all that I described to you, I've become an American who cares about Europe, which you can put in all capitals, capital A, capital W, et cetera. And frankly, I think we all should be Americans who care about Europe. The EU population and GDP are pretty impressive. 450 million population. Its GDP is third in the world collectively after the United States and China. They represent 15% of global GDP. That's, of course, assuming that they're unified, which they've had a little trouble with in recent years, and we can talk about that. And I think it's also worth taking a moment to consider how miraculous the EU and NATO are. Europe, as I'm sure all of you know from your study of history, Europe tore itself apart for centuries. The 30 Years' War, which happened in the 1600s, resulted in what was then the whole Roman Empire, but is now Germany, losing about 50% of its population, its entire population, and about 4.5 to 8 million people overall. Just absolutely devastating. And it was all over differences of opinion about religion, actually within Christianity, which I would surmise was probably one of the significant factors in ultimately the Enlightenment of the 1700s, and ultimately the people who founded our country deciding that church and state should be separate because they make a pretty dangerous cocktail when they're combined. And all that was long before the 20th century, where again, there was another spasm of violence and 100 million people were killed in World War II alone. And this is sort of the miraculous thing, since the end of World War II, we've had 8 decades of peace and prosperity on that continent that suffered so much strife beforehand. And so it's not a coincidence, in my view. It's the result of a lot of hard work and a lot of important diplomacy and a kind of a global architecture that the United States played a key role in and still does play a key role in. I should have said, by the way, at the top, now it seems like a good time to mention it, that just as the Chappaqua Library is nonpartisan, I too am nonpartisan, certainly for the purposes of this talk. I represent the entire United States of America from sea to shining sea, and the way that they vote is I vote too, but when it's my job to represent America, I represent everybody. And in the course of this talk, I won't be making any partisan comments. But I will every now and again, I'll be showing my opinion about certain policies. But that will be my opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of the entire State Department when I do so. So when I say that I'm a big supporter of NATO and the EU, for example, I am. Personally and professionally, I guess you could say. Now, one thing I thought would be interesting to lay out for you in the time I have allotted before we get to Q&A is that, because I've served in both Moscow and Warsaw, I got a little bit of a window in both cases into what you might call the national psyche in both places. And I do think, at the risk of being facile, that there is such a thing as a national psyche in different countries. There are certain key formative aspects to the history of the people, the culture, the experiences they've been through. And so the Polish take on something like NATO or EU is obviously diametrically opposed to the Russian one. In the case of Poland, you've got a country that was wiped off the map of Europe for 123 years. And that was before the Nazis and the Soviets came along. So Poland has had a pretty rough modern history. They were actually something of a temporary superpower for the first half or so of the 1600s, combined with their neighbor Lithuania, which you can see on the map that Professor Friedman has helpfully put up there. They are neighbors, but in the 1600s, actually, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really big. And that had a certain effect on the Russian psyche, which we'll get to. But that was kind of their relatively brief golden era as far as being a great power. And by the 1800s, actually by the late 1700s, they were getting divvied up by aggressive neighbors. And as I say, wiped off the map completely for 123 years, all the way up to the end of World War I. And then things got even uglier in the 20th century. Polls will tell you, and here's where I get into the readings that I mentioned to you, this book, Not 1 Inch. Not 1 Inch is a fascinating account of differing narratives on how NATO expanded after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And long story short, there's a difference of opinion as to what we and the Russians agreed upon when they started to take their troops out of East Germany and out of Eastern Europe. And the Russians claimed that our then Secretary of State, James Baker, pledged that we would not expand NATO 1 inch to the east, provided they did that drawdown. James Baker and Americans have claimed that no, we never made such a promise. The book is riveting, and it just kind of gives a blow-by-blow description of everything that was going on at that heady time there in 1989, 1991. But one thing the polls will tell you regarding NATO is there was kind of a narrative that Russia wouldn't be so aggressive if it weren't for NATO. NATO is the fact that they feel threatened by the West, and that NATO is an alliance aimed at forestalling Russian, previously Soviet, now Russian aggression. That's a justifiable reason for Russia to be kind of paranoid and aggressive. The problem with that argument from the Polish standpoint is that Russia was being aggressive towards Poland a very long time before NATO ever was a concept in anybody's head, including and especially that partition of Poland that I mentioned that began in 1795. And then Poland also, and again, this is a pretty long story, but Poland bore the brunt of a lot of communist or the Soviet version of communist oppression for whatever reason. And it sort of came to a peak in the 1980s, to a crescendo when Solidarity was founded, because obviously the communists who were in power saw Solidarity as a threat, and they cracked down particularly harshly. There's actually a book I just finished reading. I didn't mention this in my email to you about recommended readings, and now the name of the book is going to escape me. I think it's called the CIA Book Club, but that was a really fascinating read as well. It's an account of how the United States was basically smuggling all kinds of books into Poland in the 1980s via the CIA, which, as intel operations go, this is not a particularly nefarious one. I mean, they were, getting books into Poland is a good thing. I mean, it was books of all different kinds, but obviously the authorities didn't like it and cracked down on it. And there was this really intense alliance between Pope John Paul II, who was Polish, and Ronald Reagan. And to this day, the Poles really revere Reagan. In fact, when I was at the embassy there, right across the street, there was the statue of Reagan that they had there. And so all of this is to say that when I was in Poland, and we were talking about the Russian war in Ukraine and Russian aggression and everything that's going on currently, I found it at times difficult to have a really nuanced conversation with my Polish counterparts about Russia. Because, for example, if I would say something like, well, let's try to get to the Russians' heads and see what motivates them and, sort of plan our strategy with the understanding of what makes them tick. The response I tend to get was like, let's not talk about what makes them tick. They're just bad. They just have to be, pushed back, whatever, this government, Putin has to be destroyed, et cetera. And, I'm no fan of Putin, no fan of what Russia has been doing for the last couple of decades, obviously. But, it was, I just feel like the emotion was, the heart was overwhelming the head in a lot of ways. And it's understandable considering everything they've been through. The other thing that I noticed is that in regard to Russian aggression, the further east you get, the more there is a sense of we're on the front lines and we're going to be the first victims if the Russians ever really just do roll across Europe altogether. And so there's a really strong sense of we need to have really robust military, we need to be prepared. There was a meeting of NATO in Wales in 2010 where everybody made a kind of a gentleman's agreement pledge to spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And that was an agreement that was honored in the breach by many European countries for many years. And starting with the Obama administration, the United States was gently but firmly trying to encourage our European allies to spend more on defense. But Poland never needed any encouragement. They were already spending a lot. And the same thing with the three Baltic countries, the former Soviet republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And so what's happened recently, ever since Trump's second administration started, is a much more stark push of our European allies to spend more on their defense, sort of with the kid gloves off, I guess you could say. And that has resulted now in a new pledge that everyone's going to spend at least 3.5% of their GDP on defense. But again, Poland, even before that pledge, was already spending 4% or even 5%, depending on how you measure it. And so I had my team actually writing reports back to Washington about, sort of the mentality on the front lines of NATO states, given Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's what we call, by the war in Ukraine, we refer to as the full-scale invasion, because the understanding is that Russia already invaded Ukraine in 2014 when they took over Crimea, and they started sending intel people into the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. They just kind of made it more official in 2022. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Now, if you go over to the Russian mentality, their sense, and this is deeply woven into the national psyche, their sense is that they are always in danger of being overrun. In the Middle Ages, it was the Mongols. In the 1800s, it was Napoleon. Then in World War II, it was Hitler. And all of these were devastating invasions, of course. And both Poland and Russia have in common the fact that this is sort of flat land steppe that's very easy for horses to gallop across or tanks to blitzkrieg across. In fact, the name of Poland means literally the place of the fields. So I mentioned to you that Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was at the doorstep of Moscow in 1612. And in fact, if you go to Red Square, right in front of St. Basil's Cathedral, you'll see a statue of two of the heroes of Russia repulsing that attack. Needless to say, Russia has been more the aggressor ever since, but they don't necessarily see it that way. And to the extent that they do see it that way, they have a kind of an imperial mentality of sort of manifest destiny to control the general region. Putin infamously referred to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century geopolitically. They see Ukraine as naturally theirs. Their kind of ancestors as a nation started in Kiev, the so-called Kievan Rus. And The name of the country of Ukraine, by the way, means place that is on the edge of something. And the assumption the Russians make is, oh, that means it's on the edge of the Russian Empire. In fact, no, they got that from being on the edge of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Either way, I kind of wish Ukraine had done a little rebranding and changed their name to something besides place that is on the edge of other places, because it doesn't even put an encouraging symbol in people's minds that they deserve to be an independent country, which I certainly believe they do. For those who don't know, by the way, Ukraine, the sort of the western half of Ukraine had been part of Poland before World War II, and the western half of Poland had been part of Germany before World War II, and all the borders shifted. So all the more reason why the Poles feel a really close affinity with Ukrainians, although Putin tries to use it as a piece of propaganda that, oh, Poland just wants to divvy up Ukraine with us so it can get its land back, which is obviously nonsense. And that actually leads me to another point about Russia, which is Russia has always had a deeply cynical view of the world. And when I used to talk to them about human rights, they were like, yeah, right, human rights. There's no such thing as human rights. What are you really trying to do? What's your angle? And just try, and I at the end of my 3 years in Moscow, I concluded that, we're not as cynical as the Russians, like we're more naive than the Russians can imagine. And the Russians are more cynical than we can imagine. And each of us kind of projects it onto the other. Like we think, well, they must have ideals of some kind, and they just don't, aside from defending Mother Russia. And they think we always must have some kind of cynical angle. And so, for example, things like NATO expansion, the idea that all these countries that join NATO can make decisions for themselves about what they want to do politically. And the decision was, we would like to be protected from Russia by the United States of America, seems to be incomprehensible to them. They just view it as, oh yeah, well, they're just pawns on the chessboard and we move them around. And you see that even to this day with the Ukraine war, that same mentality. There's also a lot of nonsensical propaganda from Russia based on the unfortunate fact that there were some Ukrainians who supported Germany in World War II, largely, I think, as an effort to push back on Soviet domination, but to some degree also because of genuine racism. The Russians have now seized on that to say that their entire invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion since 2022, was to denazify Ukraine, which is too silly to even talk about, and therefore I will move on. I'll comment briefly. How am I doing on time? Okay. I'll comment briefly on domestic politics as I saw them in both places. This Russian story is a short and sad one, which is basically, I served in Russia from 2008 to 2011, and this is only a few years or so after Russia started to take a very dark turn politically. It had kind of experimented with democracy throughout the 1990s after the fall of communism. The experiment was a failure economically. They tried to do a lot of market shock treatment. It plunged a lot of people into poverty, and people came to associate democracy with economic misery. And they wanted a strong leader to come back, and a sober one, because Yeltsin had a drinking problem, and Putin was their answer. And then they had an oil boom in the mid-2000s, and then that just increased Putin's popularity. And he also appeared to be like, oh, here's a guy who can stand up to the West. So it's just gotten worse and worse ever since then politically in Russia. And I can get more into that in the Q&A if people are interested. As for Poland, it's more complicated and more interesting. Poland had a right-wing populist government led by a party called Law and Justice in power from 2015 to 2023. I arrived there in 2024. Right when I was kind of getting ready and learning Polish and doing all that stuff to go over there is when Law and Justice was voted out, and a new party, a coalition of center to center left parties came in, and their plan was to basically try to restore the rule of law as they saw it in Poland, which is tricky because as a colleague of mine noted in a report back to Washington, it's this dilemma of, if you bring knives to a gunfight, you're going to lose, but if you bring guns, then you're just the same as the other gunslinger. And so this new coalition is trying to not harm the rule of law in the process of restoring the rule of law. Not always a super easy thing to do, but it was a pretty fascinating thing to watch. Poland remains deeply divided. The right-wing populist half is pretty happy about Trump. The other half is very unhappy about Trump. But what makes Poland different from some other European countries that are also grappling with right-wing populism is that, for example, in a place like Hungary or now Slovakia, under Orban and under Fico, respectively, there's a lot of kind of friendly stuff towards Putin and Russia. Orban, in particular, has vetoed a lot of EU sanctions against Russia since the full-scale invasion. In Poland, across the board, the hatred of Russia is so deep that the right-wing populists have to be careful. They can't be seen as being too friendly to Putin. And then just a couple more things before we go to Q&A. I'll just mention regarding the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that, in my opinion, this was an enormous overreach on Putin's part and a strategic blunder of proportions. Hard to think of a precedent aside from the precedent of Stalin annihilating all of his generals right before getting invaded by the Nazis. But if you don't count that, this is one of the greatest blunders in Russian history, in my view. The Russian playbook for the years leading up to 2022 was frankly much smarter, evil but smart. They would just simply destabilize all their neighbors. They would get a hold of a little enclave of territory, and then they would say, well, we have to protect that enclave against the mean, nasty people in the capital. And so, for example, they did that in Moldova with a little sliver of land called Transnistria. They did that in Ukraine in 2014 with the Crimea. This is kind of their playbook, and frankly, it was a pretty effective one. Whereas this full-scale invasion in 2022, I think there was a lot of hubris behind it. They thought it was going to be a cakewalk. They were going to be greeted as liberators. They thought Europe was weak and divided, and the U.S. was distracted. And since 2022, Russia's lost 1 million people, 1 million soldiers, and gained comparatively little because the region that they've officially taken over, they were always sort of unofficially, in a large degree of control of. There are now 2 NATO members, Sweden and Finland. Europe has significantly weaned itself off Russian gas, which used to be a big piece of leverage. 40% of European gas was supplied by Russia in 2021, only 10% now. In the meantime, Russia is engaging in a lot of hybrid warfare and sabotage towards NATO countries, but they really don't dare directly invade. And I saw some of the hybrid and sabotage when I was in Poland. That border that you can see on the map that Poland shares with Belarus, the Russians would encourage, or I think probably even pay migrants to commit acts of violence against Polish border control, in the full knowledge that this would cause a big domestic political storm in Poland, because migration is such an enormous issue throughout Europe and also the United States. We can talk in the Q&A about sort of how the EU is handling all this. I would say, and that was one thing I mentioned in my suggested readings, there's a fascinating book with the provocative title, After Europe, written by a brilliant Bulgarian theorist named Ivan Krastev. Thankfully, Krastev was wrong in predicting the EU would break up in the next 10 years because 2025 is come and gone and the EU still exists. But he was certainly correct that there would be a lot of centrifugal force on it and a lot of tension pulling it apart. And he was absolutely correct that the number one pressure on both Europe and the United States in terms of its domestic politics was going to be migration. And that remains obviously the central issue. And we see that with our own debates. So I will stop there, and I am more than happy to answer people's questions and stop flapping my gums.
Peter, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I've got a question. You accurately pointed out that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is now obviously a terrible strategic error. The problem is that his ego and his incredible determination to recreate the Kievan Rus, as you said, is still pressing him despite all the negatives, the draining of the treasury, the casualties, and so forth. What would your thought be? Are we going to be out of this thing with some kind of a compromise at some point that he will be able to sell to the Russian people and keep his job? I mean, clearly he's threatened by being viewed as a wimp and surrendering the advances he's made. And yet he didn't want to back off. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I would add that he's in a lot of trouble, I think economically now in Russia as well.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, his big selling point and with the authoritarianism in the 2000s was, sure, I'm curtailing free media and my thugs are beating people up in the streets and dragging them away and all that, but you need a strong hand at the helm, and in return, I'm going to give you all this prosperity that you never had before. And Russians famously are happy with very little in terms of material wealth. It's you just give them the tiniest crumbs and you tell them, well, this is all on behalf of Mother Russia. And they kind of go, okay, well, if it's for Mother Russia, I mean, in some ways, they're a tough adversary for us culturally because, we Americans have had it pretty good over the course of our history. And I don't think we're really, as a people, able to absorb the kind of deprivations that Russian people are. And so, but there are limits to that. And right now, the sanctions have had their bite. The sanctions are not a silver bullet. They're not like a magic wand, but they do have an effect on people's calculus. And at this point, the interest rates in Russia are 21%. 50% of the population is living at the poverty level. I'm old enough to remember Jimmy Carter getting thrown out of the White House because interest rates were 21%. There were some other factors as well, and again, Americans have higher expectations. But still, so I agree with you about all that. As far as the hubris is concerned, you touched on something. I think Putin, like all authoritarians, nobody really wants to tell him the truth, right? So he's going to be surrounded by people who say like, "Yeah, you're doing a great job, sir." Even if everything's going to hell, because nobody wants to be the one to put the bell on the cat. And this is why authoritarianism ultimately is not a very effective kind of government strategically. And the other thing is also saving face. I don't. At this point, they're in so deep that and this comes up a lot in the. In the diplomatic biz, you're constantly, anytime you're trying to get to any kind of deal, it's always like, all right, well, how can everybody walk out of here with their head held high and sell it to their own people? They're like, oh, I didn't capitulate, I didn't cave, And so that's a tricky one in this case. The reality is that before the full-scale invasion, the eastern half of Ukraine was more Russian speaking and the western half was more Ukrainian speaking. And I remember a friend of mine once joking that, yes, that's a good point. Russian tanks are not equipped with backup lights. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's not going well for them. And they got caught completely by surprise too by the drone technology from the Ukrainians and just the willingness to fight. But yeah, I mean, that willingness to fight, everyone from Ukraine was not really, anyone from Ukraine was really in the tank for Russia, I think has already moved to Russia. And so that leaves a very highly kind of inflamed Ukrainian population against Russia. So before they did this, the Russian playbook for controlling Ukraine was have the little green man in Donbass, take a chunk of territory like Crimea, but also have somebody pliant in power, who was Yanukovych. And what led to the 2014 crisis was this Maidan revolution against Yanukovych, because Yanukovych had decided, since he tilted toward Russia, that he wasn't going to sign an EU accession agreement. And so people went and protested in the streets, they started getting shot, and it led to this revolution that ultimately threw out Yanukovych. And that's another thing that freaks out Putin is he hates these so-called color revolutions, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003. Any sort of democratic people power revolution on Russia's borders gives the Kremlin the willies, because they're thinking, well, what if our own people get that idea? Then they might do the same thing, and then we're going to get strung up. So Yanukovych getting kicked out was really bad news for the Russians, and I think they've been pushing hard for they want to guarantee the Ukraine's never going to join NATO. They want to take all the territory they took and even some more they haven't taken yet, and they want somebody pliant in Kiev. And I don't think they're going to get all that. I think they will probably be able to hold on to the territory they've conquered. I think even Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has said that. Ukraine joining NATO, this is very much, I'm getting very, very much into my own opinion territory. This is not official US policy, but I do think that Ukraine joining NATO will be difficult. Because NATO has this plank, and again, I apologize if I'm saying stuff that everybody knows. Just want to make sure I'm not, that I'm explaining everything in case anyone doesn't. But NATO has this plank called Article 5, which basically says, any member of NATO gets attacked, the rest of NATO has to go to war against the attacker. And Article 5 has been invoked exactly once in the history of NATO on behalf of the United States after 9/11, which is something that it's very unfortunate if people now forget about what our European allies have been prepared to do for us. Anyway, what that basically means is if Ukraine were to join NATO and the Russians started doing the kind of stuff to Ukraine they've been doing for the last decade plus, we would be, our treaty obligation would be World War III, essentially, with all the nuclear weapons and everything that entails. So I'm not saying Ukraine can never join NATO, but or maybe the part of Ukraine that's not ceded to Russia, if there's ever a peace deal, maybe it could. I don't know, but it would be a very complicated matter. Let's put it that way. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
Pretty much, not entirely, but thank you.
Some of it maybe, yeah.
Peter,
Yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
European countries are increasing their defense spending. Realistically, how strong are they now? I mean, they are avid fighters when need be, and anti-Russian, but realistically.
No, I'm really glad you raised that. In fact, that was an item that I intended to bring up in my talk, and I'm glad you jogged my memory.
I'm here for you.
Yeah. The situation with European defense is problematic. It's good that they're stepping up the spending now. But when I was in Poland, because Poland does have a free press, there were a lot of commentators that said, great that you're spending all this money, but throwing money at the problem is not the whole story. There's training, there's, getting people ready to use the latest technology, et cetera. And they're not wrong about that. And the biggest problem with Europe right now, well, first off, there's interoperability, right? I mean, the reason why we have a constitution in the United States is because the Articles of Confederation didn't work. If we were going to create a new country, the new country had to be that. It couldn't be these 13 different states that were all using different currencies and everything, And Europe, of course, has never become the United States of Europe. There's 28 different countries, a lot of them, each with their own interests. They work together remarkably well, considering. And when I was in Poland, there was a lot of talk about the so-called Weimar Triangle, which is Poland, Germany, and France. There were some personality clashes there between the various leaders, but the Weimar Triangle works reasonably well together. But in general, when you talk about the nuts and bolts of it with defense, you have different tanks in different countries, you have different train systems. Like, if the Russians start, God forbid, if they start rolling through Europe, are these folks all ready? France has 2 divisions at the ready, 2. D-Day, there were 30 divisions that came in, yikes, So I think the desire is there, but I've been hearing for years and years. In fact, frankly, I've been hearing it from Europeans who get fed up with being ordered around by Uncle Sam. They say, we'll show you, we're going to stand up our own defense. And the American response is usually like, please, don't throw me in the briar patch. Like, this is what we want you guys to do. There's a little bit of a tension because we want Europeans to do a better job of defending themselves. We also economically like it when they buy all the American defense stuff. So there's a little bit of a tension there. But by and large, yeah, interoperability is a problem, and just getting everybody on the same page is a problem. And there again, we have to talk about the difference between the eastern edge of Europe and the western edge, because Spain and Portugal are just, they're not feeling it. If you're in Lisbon and people are like, watch out, the Russians are coming. They're like, what are you talking about? So it's France has always gotten it and still gets it. In my personal opinion, France gets a really bad rap when it comes to defense. They can get a little obstreperous sometimes. They like to think of themselves as being sort of the linchpin of continental Europe. De Gaulle infamously got out of NATO in the 1960s. I was reading Churchill's memoirs. Even Churchill was complaining about de Gaulle. The whole World War II, de Gaulle was being a pain. But at the end of the day, we know that these allies are there for us, and we're there for them, notwithstanding anything you may have heard. But the lack of unanimity and interoperability and everything is definitely worrisome to me when I think about what the Russians might be capable of. I'll mention one other thing that worries me, that came up when I was in Poland. There was a little known area called the Suwalki Gap. And actually, if Professor Freeman could put that map up for a sec, I will try to delineate the Suwalki Gap for you. But it's basically, if you look at the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, there's a southern border to Lithuania. And then right next to Lithuania, there's a little Russian enclave called Kaliningrad. And then right next to that, there's Belarus, which, for the purposes of our discussion, is controlled by Russia. It's kind of more complicated than that, but in fact, Belarus was used as kind of a staging ground for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So if you look, you see that little digit of Poland that goes in between the purple thing there, that's the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, and then Lithuania, and then Belarus. So if the Russians were to come out of Belarus and cut off that little gap called the Suwalki Gap, they would cut off three NATO countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, from the rest of NATO, and it would be a very dangerous threat. So it's the kind of thing that keeps policymakers up at night. But let's hope the Russians have sated their appetite for aggression for the time being. But if you listen to my Polish friends, tell it they have not sated their appetite. So we should be vigilant.
Thank you.
Peter, can I ask you to go back to a point you made about the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe, whether it's the AfD or Marine Le Pen in France, how much would or will increasing support for these parties really change posturing to Russia? I mean, you said in the context of Poland that even the Law and Justice Party had to walk this tightrope.
Yeah.
They couldn't be too cozy with Russia because Polish nationalism would that's sort of an antithetical thing. But
Right.
This is a trend throughout Europe, and this really could change NATO's kind of core character.
Yeah, that's right. Well, regarding Poland, and then I can talk about the rest of Europe. But regarding Poland, the tightrope is absolutely visible there, and it was interesting to watch. There was this really unfortunate encounter. I guess it's about a year ago now, when Zelensky visited the Oval Office, and things went very poorly in that meeting. Watching Polish politicians react to that was instructive on this issue, because the ones, the center left ones, the ones who are not simpatico with Trump, said, "Oh, this is a disgrace. He's throwing Zelensky under the bus. This and that." The Law and Justice ones were, they kind of had to tiptoe around a little bit more. It was a little bit more acrobatics for them. There is, by the way, a far right and rather racist party in Poland called Konfederacja, which doesn't have a lot of traction. They kind of got up to they're mostly single digits in the polls. I think they got up to about 10% in a recent election, but they're still pretty negligible. And Konfederacja has shown a little more willingness to act more like Viktor Orban or Le Pen or AfD, when it comes to Russia. But you're right that, in the other parts of Europe, I remember when I was in Israel, I was joking with somebody that under Netanyahu, at least, Israel is a red state, because Netanyahu has really decided to just completely align himself with the Republican Party, much to the chagrin of the left-leaning voters in Israel who don't like that at all. But at the time, I would have said, if someone said, "Well, what are some examples of blue states?" I would have said, "Oh, places like France and Germany." And it's certainly true that I think when it comes to things like climate change, social welfare, things like that, the average right of center, like let's say center right European, would be considered a lefty in America. It's just, there's still that sort of fundamental divide. But migration has had this really profound effect, to the point where, right-wing populist parties are now, doing well in the polls in places like France, I guess to a lesser degree, Germany, Britain. I'm sure this is something that, if they're going to make friendly noises to Putin, I'm sure Putin will be very excited to hear it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fundamental fact that Putin's Russia represents a threat to the continent of Europe that little else does. And, it's kind of like, it's sort of like the answer that I have in my back pocket in case somebody asks me something that could get me in trouble in terms of partisanship. Like, oh, where do you come down? Who do you like? One thing I always say, and it has as we say in diplomacy, it has the added benefit of being true, is that our interests don't really change no matter who's in power. We have the same challenges, the same goals, same interests. What changes is the strategy for how we get to those. How do we promote those interests? How do we face those challenges? There we have a difference of opinion, but Iran is always going to be a threat and a source of, a funder of terrorism and, whatever, as long as it's the Islamic Republic of Iran and has the current mullahs in charge, no matter who's in charge on our side of the ocean. And Putin's always going to be a threat. So, I mean, actually, good example, I think, is what Giorgia Meloni has done in Italy, which is, when she was running, she, I believe, declared herself to be an admirer of Mussolini. She may have walked that one back, I forget, but there was a lot of concern, like, oh, what does it mean that this far-right person is going to come in? And she did some stuff in terms of the culture wars, anti-trans stuff or whatever. But at the end of the day, she hasn't vetoed any of the rounds of sanctions against Putin. She's been pretty solid. She was a pretty solid partner for Biden in facing down Putin. So it's hard to predict what people do when they get in power. Ariel Sharon, when he was a right-wing firebrand in Israel, did a lot of very aggressive stuff. And then when he was prime minister, he almost single-handedly produced a two-state solution. And then he got a stroke, but that's another story. But Sharon would have been the least likely guy in the world to do that. And the quote from him was, "The throne looks a lot different when you're looking at it from far away than when you're sitting in it." So I guess all that is to say that my family accuses me of being Mr. Pollyanna, and I'm certainly living up to that with my answer to your question. But the hope would be that if any of these folks got into power, they would realize, where their country's interests lie when it comes to Russia.
I had one quick question. Peter, this has been wonderful. Thank you. What about energy for Eastern Europe?
Yeah. Well, when I was in Poland, I can't take any credit for this. This is all the econ section, but we signed a huge deal where Westinghouse was going to create three small modular nuclear reactors in Poland. And the SMRs were a threefer because it means less gas leverage for Russia. It was good for American companies, and it's a climate change issue. When I was a kid, people were worried about the environment and were left-leaning and all these no nukes signs. Things have changed. Now nukes are, much better. The safeguards are better, and we're much more worried about things like climate change. So Poland, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think has actually completely eliminated its dependence on Russian gas, like not a single molecule now, And again, Poland feels more strongly about this than everybody else. But Europe has done a good job. I think they've weathered some of the toughest winters that they were going to have during the course of the Ukraine war. And again, this is part of why it was such a blunder what Putin did, because gas used to be the big lever. When I was in Moscow, there was that 1 year, as Amy Friedman mentioned, I was covering the frozen conflicts for a part of my time there. And things were pretty quiet on the Ukrainian front when I was covering it because Yanukovych was in power and they got along. But every single time somebody in Ukraine did something the Russians didn't like, they'd turn off the gas. Oh, okay. And it was everything from, taking down a statue that had been, commemorating a Russian war general or something, a Soviet one, I should say. They've lost that now, and they're not going to get it back. One thing I think the Russians don't understand is when you make everything all about interests and not about values, and not about friendships, then nobody as soon as you lose your piece of leverage, nobody has any more reason to work with you anymore. And the bonds we have with Europe go incredibly deep. When I was covering the Benelux countries, uh, I remember hearing about a little area near Omaha Beach where, well, I'm mixing it up because Omaha Beach is in France. The Dutch version there was sort of like an area where a bunch of American servicemen fell in battles that were related to the Normandy invasion. And there were Dutch families that would just kind of toddle over there and take care of those graves, every year. Like that kind of stuff doesn't get erased. And it's true that in international relations, supposedly there are no friendships, only interest, but I think actually some of those bonds are deeply important. And Russia losing that gas leverage, I think, is really going to come back to haunt it. Yeah, I mean, as far as other energy issues are concerned, yeah, I mean, globally, again, given my own personal opinion, I really wish we had not ceded a near monopoly over renewables and electric cars to our greatest geopolitical rival, China. But we did. So there we are.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Peter, can I ask you a question that maybe links back to some of the suggested readings that you included, which is this question about identity and Central Europe. And maybe it's wishful thinking at this point, because it really seems as if the choice is between, being closer to Russia and being in Russia's sphere of influence, or being part of Western Europe, right? Being part of NATO, part of the EU, part of, kind of that alliance. But is there a way that you can kind of articulate a vision where Central Europe isn't caught in really this pull between Russia and the West?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, when Biden was still in power, the geopolitical winds had shifted enough, I think, that commentators were already talking more about the quote return of great power competition, and the sort of 2-decade-long post 9/11 kind of war on terror, global war on terror state of affairs was receding into the background, which is not to say at all that Islamic extremism has ceased to be a threat. God knows it still is, but there was already that sense of like, okay, this is less on the front burner, and now we're getting a little bit more into, the old spheres of Soviet sphere, China sphere, and East Asia, and our sphere. And some folks, and they're not wrong to say it, pointed to the fact that if you look at the 1800s, that was a reasonably stable century in terms of wars between the great powers, and there was a lot of realpolitik and spheres and that kind of thing. And I remember actually when you and I were sitting side by side in history class in high school, hearing about nationalism in the 1800s and thinking it had a positive vibe for me because I'm an American, and I think in terms of people's freedom, and I thought, yeah, Poland they should be free, the Poles, the Czechs, the Hungarians, whoever else. These empires, forget them. That's not how things should be. Now, I have to say, as a Jewish person, someone not long ago made an interesting point that Jews tend to do better with empires than with countries, and that's because nationalism is not, it has that ugly side to it that tends to be pretty dangerous for Jewish people, most obviously with the Nazis. But empires tend to be more cosmopolitan and they accept different sort of ethnicities and so on. So, which I thought was an interesting take on the whole thing. It doesn't really square well with the 19th century movement of Zionism that's resulted in Israel. But that's a whole other, we have to do a separate Zoom call on that one. Part of me wants to say, yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, when you talk about things like NATO and the EU, these are all things that were freely entered into. I mean, the Russians like to think of, the Soviet Warsaw Pact agreement as being the same as NATO, which is nonsense. The Warsaw Pact was done at the barrel of a gun. NATO, the Poles wouldn't leave us alone. They were sleeping on our doorstep, harassing us. Come on, let us in. It's as you'll read in Not One Inch. There's a lot of pressure on the Clinton administration to accept these new members, and with good reason. So, you know, but it's it's different if you say, okay, they're a NATO ally or they're in the EU. Does that mean that there's this big global chess match and we're just moving our pieces and they're moving theirs? I'd like to say no, but we've all heard these proverbs about how when the elephants fight, the ants get stepped on, and so on. It's true. If you're a smaller country and your neighbors are fighting with each other, it's very likely not to go well for you. All that said, I mean, we are in an interesting point right now where the current administration has made clear it's feeling that America should not, be policing the world. We've gotten ourselves, in their view, overextended with too many entanglements. We should be, leaving people to solve their own regional problems. And that's sort of one of the paradoxes of, I would say one of the paradoxes of empire or implied empire, since we don't have an actual empire, is local bullies bully smaller countries, and then the smaller countries ask bigger bullies to come over and bully the local bullies. And this has been going on since Roman Empire, probably even before, since then. And the reality is that I think a lot of Europeans, as we've started to pull back, don't want to see us do that. Right. I really have to be careful not to get myself in trouble on that one, because I have many opinions. It's an extremely hot button topic over there. But anyway, I mean, when I was at the Fletcher School, which is international affairs program where I was when I took the foreign service exam, there was this international law professor who was one of these sort of celebrity professors that everyone wanted to take. I never ended up having the time on my schedule to take him, but I heard all about him. He was this expert in international law, but one of the central theses was international law is in the eye of the beholder, and depending on who you talk to, it doesn't really exist because law isn't really worth much if you can't enforce it. If you were walking down the street and you got mugged and you called the police and the policeman came over and he pointed a finger at the mugger and he said, "You're a very bad person," and he took off, that wouldn't help you much with the mugger, right? But that's sort of what the UN does, So then who's got the teeth, to enforce bad guys not being bad guys? Well, it's a little bit like a schoolyard where there's no teacher, and so the biggest kid is the one that just has to kind of enforce order, and you just hope the biggest kid is not going to be a bully himself. And I would argue that we have been that big kid who, depending on what lens you look at it through, we haven't been too much of a bully over the course of these past 8 decades. And I think it's had a pretty good result, and I'd be in favor of maintaining that system. But we should view it for what it is, which is we are a country with our own interests. We have our values too, and we try to advocate for both at the same time, but we don't succeed because, the world is kind of a rough place. So I don't know if that answers your question, Amy. I mean, I guess what I would say is, there will always be these really passionate national identities in Central Europe, and provided they don't tip over into racism and xenophobia, we should back them up, especially against would-be imperialists from the East.
So how much do you think, from working within the State Department over a fairly long period of time, how much do you think our policies have been influenced by values? You said before that our interests have stayed, pretty consistent across administrations, but there has been a sense at times, not always, but at times, that values diplomacy has mattered, right? Values about human rights, about democracy, about freedom, from inside the machine, so to speak. How much has values influenced what you've done or what the priorities have been overseas?
Well, when I joined the Foreign Service, one of my concerns, aside from things like what's it like to raise kids and stuff like that, was I thought, well, what happens if there's a policy I don't agree with, And I talked to more seasoned veterans about it, and they said, well, we can go at hammer and tongs behind the scenes. We can have really impassioned arguments amongst ourselves, but then when we talk to reporters, we go in front of the cameras, we do our job as diplomats. we have to go out there and explain the policies of whoever's in the White House at the time and defend American interests as that White House sees them and American values as that White House sees them. And if you ever get to a point where you just feel like I can't do it, then then you have to resign, basically, And I joined right around the time of the the second Iraq War, under Bush Jr. And I thought that really was not a good idea. I didn't oppose it as passionately as some people because some people thought it was just a purely evil idea from Alpha to Omega to take out, overthrow Saddam Hussein by force of arms. And I was like, have you met Saddam Hussein? This is a guy who literally studied Hitler, Stalin, and Mao to get ideas on how to run his country. So the idea that we were doing an unequivocally horrible thing to Iraq by kicking out Saddam was to me debatable. Nevertheless, I thought the Iraq War was a bad idea. And had I been in charge at the time, I would have said, let's not do that. But I wasn't in charge. And so I went to Dubai for my first tour and I talked to a lot of, Arab and Muslim folks over there, journalists, students, whoever. And, I gave the best rationale I could for why the Bush administration had decided on this course of policy. And I thought, okay, let's see where this goes from here. And over the course of these 20 odd years, there have been some things I've been really enthusiastic to promote and others less so. But I've never gotten to a point where I thought, okay, I'm being asked to publicly go to bat for something that I just absolutely cannot. The Zelensky thing might have been a little tricky for me if I'd been asked to go out and publicly say, hey, like what we did with Zelensky was great, like that. I might have had some trouble with that, but nobody asked me to. So, and that was fairly soon before I left Warsaw. So I will say this about values, that I think the United States of America was created by people who they got that really rare opportunity that people get in life, which is sort of a chance to start over, right? Like when I met, like Amy Friedman mentioned that she and I have known each other since middle school. That's a slight mistake because, in fact, we met in, I think, in ninth grade in high school, and I was the new guy. And the reason I was the new guy is because I'd had a pretty unhappy time in middle school, and I thought, I want to start over again in a new school. And I got the chance to do that, and I had a wonderful time in high school. So you don't always get that chance to reinvent things, When you met me, Amy, I was implementing all my new ideas on how to get along with people socially that hadn't worked in middle school. So, the founding fathers did the same thing, except at the countrywide level. So they basically said, okay, what has not worked in Europe? We need to separate church and state because look what happened in the 30 Years' War. We need to make sure nobody gets too much power, because look what happens with King George III or whatever. Let's separate, separation of powers. They had that ability. And that was, as a teacher of mine in high school once pointed out, the real American Revolution was not the part where we were shooting guns. It was the Constitutional Convention. And it was the fact that George Washington, when he'd been president for 8 years, said, okay, I'm done now. Time, someone else's turn, when he was the most popular guy in the country and he'd been a military hero and so on, pretty much anyone up to that point in history would have said, no, I'm going to stick around and be a monarch. He said, nope, I'm gone, So that was the revolution, right? So now what do revolutions do? They usually like to export themselves. So the Russian Revolution wanted to export itself. The Iranian Revolution, the French Revolution, everyone wants to export. I would argue that we've been trying to export the American Revolution one way or another ever since we came into being. Now different people have different views on what that looks like, right? So Jimmy Carter wanted to export the revolution in terms of an emphasis on human rights. And so for that matter, did Eleanor Roosevelt, right at the end of World War II. The neocons or Bush Jr. thought, well, we want to export that, but we're going to do it by force in the case of Iraq or the Middle East. So there are different ways of going about it. Now, I think that because, unfortunately, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars went as poorly as they did, or at least they disappointed the American public to the extent that they did, there's now kind of a reaction to that, which says, Obama was already saying, let's be more humble about our ability to, shape the entire world in our image. Trump has sort of picked up on that idea of humility in that regard, but he's sort of transformed it into a different approach, which is a very interest-based approach. And if you talk to people in this administration, they'll say, "Oh, you get into all that woo-woo stuff about values. It's just interest." But I think at the end of the day, we can't stop really. I just think it's in the American DNA to care about right and wrong. And I think the people who voted for the administration have really strong views on what's right and what's wrong. They're just different views from the people who voted against it, about what that constitutes. And for that matter, I mean, you still have Trump saying to the Iranian leadership, stop massacring protesters, or we're going to step in and do something. So I don't think that American approach ever goes away completely. But, to the extent that we've had sort of a quasi-empire ever since the end of World War II, all empires grow, reach a pinnacle, and decline, and then eventually recede, and somebody else gets a shot. I don't see why it's going to be different in our case. I would say that people around the world like to complain about America. Once they start dealing with China controlling them instead, they're going to be wishing for the good old days. But but that's another matter.
June, I think you had a question, and then Naomi.
Yeah, and before that, another reading recommendation, which I didn't mention in my email, but recommend in this context of America and how we handle our values. Dangerous Nation by Robert Kagan. Fascinating read. Robert Kagan he's been branded with a neocon brush. I don't think he's quite as neocon-y as the other ones, but he makes a really strong argument in that book. Pretty much what I've been saying, that America, we can't help ourselves. We have to care about what happens in the world from a value-based standpoint, and we have to meddle in it. We do it in different ways, some more successful than others. But anyway, fantastic read, which I recommend. So sorry, now on to the next question.
So I guess my question is, how do you see sort of the youth in Central Europe? I mean, for instance, I was in Serbia, and the guide that we had I thought was interesting as a guide, was very pro-Russia. So talking back on, those were the great days that factories were operating. And now when you look around, there are fields that are fallow. The country is not doing well. Factories, are overgrown. And yet when you talk to youth, they are much more optimistic. They're also much more Western oriented. So is that typical?
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a lot of sort of communist nostalgia among older folks in the former Iron Curtain countries, because exactly what that guide said. We always knew there's going to be food on the table. Okay, fine, we couldn't get in a soapbox and yell and scream, but who needs that? If you're not getting by economically, and there has been a fair amount of brain drain in some of the poorer former communist countries. My wife is a fellow American diplomat, but she grew up in Bulgaria. The brain drain in Bulgaria, including my wife, has been staggering. I mean, just millions of people. Now, the other thing that Bulgaria has taught me, and this is relevant to what you mentioned about Serbia, some Eastern European countries have more of an emotional tie historically to Russia than others, and Serbia is very much in that category. Bulgaria is as well. Russia in the 1800s freed, as they saw it, Bulgaria from the Ottoman rule by the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which the Turks were the real hated ones for the Bulgarians, and the Russians were, co-religionists and fellow Slavs, and they were seen as they still refer to as Uncle Ivan when they talk about Russia. So the difference in mentality from Poland, where everybody despised Russia so much, to when I would go and talk to my in-laws in Bulgaria, where Russia could sort of do no wrong, including now. I mean, lots of defense of, they had to go into Ukraine because of this and that. So yeah, it's there's a generational difference. There's a difference depending on the country. And as I say, I think a lot of times when people from different countries badmouth the United States, and talk about places like Russia and China, you know, they're kind of, it's easy to kind of get lulled into taking certain things for granted, you know? I mean, you know, Russia, for just to give one example, there was a lot of anti-Americanism in among Arab countries because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the perception that we support Israel. Meantime, Bashar al-Assad was just annihilating his own people in Syria. You know, chemical warfare attacks. At least before October 7th, it was a numerical fact that Assad had killed more Palestinians than Israel had in its entire history. I don't know if that's true now. But you know, you couldn't hear a bad word about Russia, even though Assad wouldn't have remained in power if it weren't for Russia. So I think there's a certain degree of people just kind of lose the plot, you know, when they're, because America is sort of the big bad hombre on the global stage, it's easy to kind of take pot shots at us without factoring in the fact that, well, hey, you know, we don't always live up to our values, but at least we have them, you know, yeah, so.
Peter, on that same theme of sympathies for Russia, both Slovakia and Hungary, as you know, are kind of a little, shall we say, obstructionist in their sympathies for Ukraine. Could they get in the way or inhibit supplies, you know, military supplies to Ukraine if, in fact, the war worsened and NATO and European forces were trying to get through Eastern Europe to supply the battle in Ukraine? Am I phrasing that accurately, or?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't know. I don't know if it would ever rise to that level, you know, because they're kind of playing a double game because, I mean, it's not a good look ultimately to be seen as kind of a quisling where Putin is concerned, even in a place where right-wing populism is held sway. That's not Poland. I mean, Hungary, as you probably know, was brutalized in 1956 by the Soviets when they tried to have an uprising. And when I visited Budapest some years back, they still had monuments to that 1956 uprising. I'm not sure if they still do, but you know, I mean, what Orban tends to do is he tends to obstruct EU unanimous vote on sanctions because they voted on a whole bunch of different rounds of sanctions. And there was one case a couple of years ago where Angela Merkel was still in power in Germany, and she basically came up with some face-saving thing where Orban would kind of go and use the bathroom at a key moment when everybody was voting. So he didn't have to veto it, but he didn't have to vote for it either. And then they got the sanctions everybody needed, you know. And it's not easy to get everyone to agree on all this stuff. There's a huge debate right now in the EU over Russian assets because after the full-scale invasion, Russian assets, numbering, I believe, in the many billions, that were being held in Western banks were seized, but not used. Instead, what's happened is we, NATO, EU, whatever, we've used the interest off of those seized assets to fund some of Ukraine's war effort. But we haven't used the actual assets themselves because that gets us into a very dangerous legal area where Russia could retaliate in certain ways. You could set a precedent. So a lot of these questions are sort of delicate ones when you talk about the legal minutiae or the finances of it. But when you talk about straight up military, it's hard for me to imagine Orban ordering Hungarian troops to get in the way of weapons shipments to Ukraine. That's something I don't really see happening. I hope I'm right about that.
I think, Naomi, you get the last question.
Okay, unfortunately, this may be very harebrained. Is there a leader in Eastern Europe who is considered a natural convener who can bring people together when necessary?
A leader in Central Europe who can bring people together, you mean domestically in his or her own country, or you mean?
No, internationally, a convener across the Eastern Bloc.
Regionally, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting you say Eastern Bloc, because that was something I wanted to mention earlier, that, you know, Cold War is long since over, but there really is a different vibe in the former communist part of Europe versus Western Europe. And for example, paradoxically, well, I guess logically, the countries that have been controlled by the Soviet Union are the ones, at least on the front lines, who are spending the most on defense, places like Poland and the Baltics. And yet it's sort of a paradox because they're also the ones who want to rely the most on the United States. In Western Europe, I think there's a little bit of myopia in that they've been lulled by this past 80 years of relative peace and prosperity into thinking, well, we can just sit around, sipping our cappuccinos and eating our croissants and calling the Americans warmongers, and nothing bad is going to happen to us. So yeah, there's kind of I think at least, conservatives in America feel like Western Europeans are kind of ungrateful and overly cosmopolitan and, woke or whatever, whereas Eastern Europeans are traditional and religious, and also they get the Russian threat and they love America. And while that may be something of a caricature, there's a grain of truth to it in the sense that Poland loves America, very, very pro-American, and right-wing Americans, for whatever reason, just adore Poland. Like when this administration took over, one of the first visits that Hegseth, as defense secretary, made was to Poland. And he just came over and it was a love fest, and he said, "Oh, I know you guys have got it all in hand." And they told him, "Oh, we know you have it all in hand." And I thought, oh, I hope there's no difference of opinion about Ukraine because we all saw what we saw in the Oval Office. But there's just that sort of willingness to kind of give each other the benefit of the doubt. So there definitely is a different vibe in those two. There still are blocks, I guess, in a very, very different sense from what was going on during the Cold War, but there's still that sort of different feeling. That said, as I've been saying, all 28 members of the EU all seem to be spinning off in different directions at different points. And getting back to your question of whether there's somebody who can unify everyone, I'm sure Macron would have liked to be that because, as I say, the French like to sort of posture as the leaders of Europe. Henry Kissinger said, "I don't know who to talk to when I want to pick up the phone and talk to Europe. Who do I talk to?" And I think France would have been very happily give the answer, us, but that's not necessarily how their fellow Europeans feel, including in Poland. France and Poland have a very historically close relationship, but Eastern Europeans also do complain about the French being kind of arrogant towards them sometimes. So yeah, I don't know. European dynamics can get pretty prickly, and the idea that someone can unify everyone, I think Zelensky is pretty unifying in Europe. I mean, maybe not Orban, but he's widely admired across Europe. I mean, he's been incredibly brave. I mean, what do you say about a guy who, when the tanks are closing in on Kyiv in February of 2022, and someone says, "We'll give you a ride out of here," and he says, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." I mean, he's a legend. What can you say about the guy?
Yeah, but more so than at home.
That's and that's fair. I mean, Ukraine has I hate to say it, but Ukraine has a really deep-seated corruption problem, including unbelievably now. I mean, you have the situations where people are putting stuff in their pockets, and I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like when I was in Poland, I saw, I mean, there were very large numbers of Ukrainian veterans in Poland. And the Poles did an amazing job of absorbing. I think it was something like 1 million Ukrainian refugees, and there were veterans there too. And I would go to events where the veterans would talk, and a guy would be there with a prosthetic limb and everything. And to think about these people, the prosthetic limb, and someone's over there pocketing money, it would be as if like Churchill's right-hand man was like, "Oh, the London Blitz, yeah, it's pretty bad, but hey, I need a new Ferrari." Like I can't fathom it. But there are some real domestic issues that, frankly, the war is papered over in Ukraine because, prior to the war, we were being critical of Ukraine's Western partners. Were saying, you all have to get your act together. If you're ever going to think about, the prospects of joining NATO or the EU, you have to get your act together when it comes to this domestic stuff. And, and now the war happened and Zelensky was so brave and, it's like first things first, let's beat the Russians. But yeah, I mean, that's issues with democracy are still going on. I mean, there have been free and fair elections in Ukraine since the Color Revolution. In fact, Zelensky was elected by one. So that's obviously an accomplishment in its own right. But yeah, they got a ways to go before they look like Switzerland. That's for sure.
Thank you.
This is not a reading recommendation. This is a watching recommendation. But if any of you has heard of the TV show Servant of the People,
Yeah.
Sluga Narodu in Russian. This was on Netflix. For a while, it was only in Russian, but then they started doing it with English subtitles. I think they've subtitled all 3 seasons now. Mario and I were watching this. This is the show that made Zelensky famous in Ukraine. And it's one of the craziest things I've ever laid eyes on in my entire life because, Zelensky was a comedian, he was an entertainer. He was the protagonist of this show. His character in the show is a teacher whose rant about how corrupt all the officials are in Ukraine goes viral. And because it goes viral, he ends up becoming president, contrary to all his plans, expectations. He's just like, what, I'm president now? And he sets about trying to clean up the system, sort of like Mr. Smith goes to Washington kind of thing, and hijinks ensue. But my wife and I were watching this in 2023 when we were still in Israel. And we would turn it off, and then we turn on the news, and there was actual Zelensky dealing with this Russian invasion. It was the most uncanny thing I've ever experienced in my life. So anyway, Servant of the People does a really good job of capturing a lot of these domestic dilemmas that someone with their heart in the right place, whether that's Zelensky or not, I couldn't say, but someone with their heart in the right place, his character anyway, was facing all these. Yeah.
When you were watching it, I was watching it about the same time, and I just kept thinking, it's shot around Kyiv. And
Yeah.
I just kept thinking how much of what you're seeing, has been hit by missiles. And it was very dislocating to watch it.
It's terrible. Yeah. 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 Dislocating was the word. It was like uncanny valley or something. It was just, yeah, very weird.
All right. Well, join me in thanking our guests today. We'll have to have you back. One of the participants suggested having you back to talk about Zionism in the Middle East. So
I was dumb enough to
I
open
can
my.
call you in a year.
No, I'm kidding. It'll be my pleasure, but I have to be very careful on that one.
Yeah. Don't we all? Yeah.
Really interesting. Yep, provocative, candid. Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. And it's been a delight to finally meet you and be able to hear your comments, which I think also gave us so much better understanding what's going on in Europe and a lot of background. And so thank you so much for that.
It was a real pleasure.
Hope to see you again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and then join us again in 2 weeks on February 23rd when we have Nicole Bibbins-Sadaka. She will be speaking to us on democracy and foreign policy. And she is now she's a fellow at the George W. Bush Institute, where she focuses on American foreign policy and democracy. She previously was executive vice president and interim president at Freedom House, as well as professor of practice at Georgetown University, Master of Science in Foreign Science, Foreign Service. So we look forward to seeing you then. And to our friends at Chappaqua Library, thank you very much. And Leslie, thank you for helping us.
Thank
So we'll see
you.
you in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for joining us.